The conflict check came back on a Wednesday morning and I was in my office reviewing the quarterly pipeline when my junior analyst Priya knocked on the glass and came in with the printout and set it on my desk with the careful expression of someone who has found something they are not sure how to hand over. The printout was the standard Meridian conflict check form, the document we ran on every prospective engagement before we accepted it, covering client relationships, competitive conflicts, and personal connections that might compromise the firm's professional independence. I had been running conflict checks since I formalized Meridian 10 years ago, and I had never had one come back with a flag that gave me pause. This one had a flag at the bottom of the third page, in Priya's precise handwriting rather than in the printed form fields, which meant she had added it herself as a note rather than a standard disclosure. The note said, VP of Operations at Crestfield Industries is listed as Greg Holloway. Last name matches family contact and firm onboarding records. Flagging for your review. I read the note twice. I set the printout down. I looked out the window of my office at the Meridian floor, at the 19 people who worked there, at the whiteboard wall where the current client engagements were mapped in the color-coded system my operations director had developed in year 4, at the evidence arranged around me of 10 years of building something from a notebook and a failed startup in the specific, clarifying cold of being told by my older sister that she had always known this would happen. Then I picked up the printout and I wrote 3 words in the margin next to Priya's note. Conflict check clear. I put the printout in the Crestfield file. I called Marcus Webb's assistant and confirmed the engagement start date. And I did not call my sister Dana. I want to explain what I felt in that moment, because it was not triumph and not the anticipation of a scene, and not even the satisfaction I might have expected after 10 years of building without acknowledgement from the people who should have been paying attention from the beginning. What I felt was something closer to the specific settled clarity of a person who has been moving toward a point for a very long time and has just seen without drama that the point is now directly in front of her. The conflict check was clear. The engagement was sound. The work was exactly the kind of work Meridian had been built to do. Those facts were the only facts that mattered professionally, and they were sufficient. Everything else was going to happen the way it was going to happen, through the normal operations of the professional world and the normal channels through which professional reputations travel, and I was going to let it happen that way rather than engineer any version of it. I put the Crestfield file in the drawer and I opened the next item on my agenda, and I went back to work. I want to say one more thing about the moment before I closed the drawer on the Crestfield file, which is that the clarity I felt was not certainty about outcomes. I did not know what the engagement would produce in terms of the relationship with Dana. I knew what it would produce operationally, because I had assessed the Crestfield problem carefully and I understood the scope of the restructuring and I had built Meridian on exactly this kind of work. The professional certainty was complete. The personal certainty was not certainty at all but something more like readiness, the settled quality of a person who has done the preparation and is ready to see what the work produces. Both were enough. I closed the drawer and I went back to work. I need to explain Dana before I explain the 10 years because the 10 years only makes sense against the background of who she is and who we have always been to each other. Dana Whitfield Holloway is 3 years older than me, and she is not a villain. I want to be precise about that from the beginning because the story is not a story about a villain, and describing it as one would be inaccurate and would let me off the hook for the parts of it where I was not simply a victim of someone else's narrative but a person making choices about how to respond to circumstances, some of which were my fault and some of which were not, and some of which existed in the complicated space in between. Dana is a woman who processes the world through narration. She takes in events and she converts them into stories and she tells the stories to the people around her, because that is how she understands what has happened, and how she maintains the social connections she has always been skilled at and invested in. This is not a flaw exactly. It is a way of being in the world, and in most contexts it makes her warm and present and engaged and the kind of person people want to have at their table. The problem is what happens when the events she is processing belong to someone else, specifically when they belong to me, and when the story she constructs from those events is shaped by an understanding of me that stopped updating itself sometime around my 25th birthday and has been running on that fixed version ever since. The fixed version of me, in Dana's understanding, was the younger sister who took risks that didn't pay off, who had ambition that exceeded her judgment, who needed the world to be reminded that caution was a virtue. I had given her the material for this version. I could not entirely dispute that. What I disputed was that the version was the whole of it, and that the whole of it was hers to distribute. What I want to be clear about is that I love Dana. Not in the uncomplicated way of people who have never been hurt by the person they love, but in the specific, durable way of someone who has been hurt and has examined the hurt carefully and has concluded that the person who caused it was operating from the fixed version rather than from malice, which does not make the hurt smaller but makes it differently shaped. The differently shaped hurt was something I had been carrying for 11 years and had learned to carry without it defining the load, the way you carry something you have built the muscle for over a long time. I had built muscle. I could carry it. What I was carrying toward, without naming it to myself in those terms, was the moment when the fixed version and the actual version would be in the same room at the same time and the distance between them would be visible to both of us, and we would have to decide what to do with that visibility. I did not know when that moment would arrive. I had a reasonable belief that the Crestfield engagement was going to produce it. I was prepared. Vantage Systems was a supply chain optimization startup based in Austin, and I joined it at 26 as head of operations because I believed in the product and the team and because I understood, from 2 years of working as an operations analyst at a logistics company in Dallas, exactly what problem the product was solving and how well it solved it. I believed in it the way you believe in things when you are 26 and you have done your homework and you have looked at the competitive landscape and the addressable market and the team's credentials and you have concluded that this is the right bet to make at this point in your professional life. I was right about the product. I was right about the team. What I was not able to account for was the CEO's decision, in the second year of operation, to pursue an aggressive Series B at a valuation the market would not support, which burned through the remaining runway in 7 months and left the company without options. I was head of operations. I was not on the board and I was not the CFO and I did not make the funding decision and I could not undo it when it became clear what it would cost. The company folded when I was 28. No severance. A gap on the resume that needed explaining. The particular, intimate humiliation of calling your landlord to discuss February rent and understanding, in the concrete specificity of that call, what financial instability actually feels like when it is yours rather than a concept. I told my parents on a Thursday evening, which meant I told my mother Carol, which meant I told Dana, who called me that same evening with the energy of someone whose worldview had just been confirmed and who was managing the desire to say I told you so by dressing it in the language of concern. She said she had always worried. She said maybe this was a sign. She said she had been telling Greg that she wasn't sure the startup world was right for me. She said all of it in the warm, certain tone of someone who believes they are helping, and I listened to it and I said I was fine and I would figure it out and I ended the call and I sat on my couch in my apartment in Fort Worth and I thought about the gap on my resume and February rent and the specific quality of being understood by your own family as someone who needs to be told that caution is a virtue. And then I got up and I made coffee and I opened a new notebook and I wrote the date at the top of the first page. The notebook I opened that night on my couch in Fort Worth was a plain black Moleskine, the kind I had been using for work notes since my first job, and I had a habit of writing the date at the top of the first page of any new notebook because I wanted to know later when the thinking had started. The date I wrote was a Thursday in March when I was 28 years old, and what I wrote beneath it was not a business plan or a set of goals but something more like an inventory, a clear-eyed accounting of what I actually knew, what I could actually do, what the market actually needed that it was not getting, and what the gap was between those things and the shape of the business that could fill it. The inventory took 3 hours to complete. When I was done I had 12 pages in the small, dense handwriting I used when I was thinking rather than when I was presenting, and the 12 pages contained the essential architecture of what would become Meridian Advisory. I kept that notebook. It was in the bottom drawer of my desk at the Meridian office on West 7th Street, alongside every notebook I had filled since, a stack that by the time I was 39 was 23 notebooks deep. I had not told anyone about the stack. It was simply there, the record of 10 years of thinking, and it was mine. The distribution of the story happened the way distribution always happened in my family, which was through my mother's network of lateral communication, shaped and amplified by Dana's particular investment in the narrative. I did not learn the full extent of it until my cousin Becca called me 3 weeks after the Vantage collapse, which was after a family dinner I had not attended, to offer what Becca described as actual sympathy as opposed to whatever Dana had been giving people. Becca had a dry, affectionate way of delivering difficult information that I had always valued, and she delivered this particular information with the specific delicacy of someone who understands that the subject of a family narrative is not always the last to hear about it, but is often the last to understand how widely it has traveled. She said it had come up at dinner. She said several people seemed to have versions of it already. She said Dana had been describing it as Claire taking a risk and it not working out, which Becca noted was technically accurate and practically devastating, because technically accurate descriptions of failure have a way of traveling further and landing harder than obvious distortions. I said thank you to Becca and meant it completely. I did not call Dana. I did not call my mother. I understood, sitting with Becca's call, that what had just happened was not a misunderstanding or a single conversation gone wrong but a pattern, the pattern of my family's relationship to my life running on the version of me that had existed at 25, and that the pattern was not going to change through argument or confrontation or any action I could take in the immediate aftermath of a corporate failure. The only thing that was going to change it was evidence of a different kind produced over time, in the specific, undeniable form of a business that could not be described as a risk that hadn't worked out. I went back to the notebook. I wrote for 3 hours. By the end of the 3 hours I had the outline of what would become Meridian Advisory, and I had the understanding, clear and cold and entirely motivating, that I was going to build it without any of them and that I was going to build it until it was impossible to misread. The specific quality of Becca's call was something I returned to often in the years that followed, not because it had been surprising but because it had been clarifying in a way that few things were. She had given me accurate information delivered with affection and without editorializing, which was rarer than it should have been and which I had always valued in her. She had told me what was happening without telling me how to feel about it, and that restraint was a gift because it left me free to feel what I actually felt, which was not betrayal exactly and not anger exactly, but the specific cold clarity I have described before, the clarity of someone who has understood a pattern fully for the first time and can see it clearly enough to decide what to do about it. What I decided to do about it was nothing in the immediate sense and everything in the sustained sense. Nothing immediate because there was nothing to say that would not either confirm the story Dana was telling or make me look as though the failure had affected my judgment in the way she was implying it had. Everything is sustained because the only argument worth making against a fixed story is a different story, built from evidence that cannot be dismissed, produced over the kind of time that makes dismissal difficult because it requires dismissing not a single outcome but a decade of them. I had time. I had the notebook. I had clarity. I went to work. Meridian Advisory started as a consulting practice run from my apartment in Fort Worth. Initially just me and a part-time bookkeeper named Sandra who worked remotely and kept the invoices organized and the quarterly filings current, while I focused on finding clients and doing the work. The first 3 clients were companies I had identified through the operational knowledge I had built at the logistics company and at Vantage, companies in the manufacturing and distribution sectors that had the specific operational inefficiencies I knew how to address, the kind that were invisible to generalist consultants but obvious to someone who had spent 5 years embedded in operations teams. I approached them directly with a specific diagnostic offer, a 3-week assessment of their operational systems at a fixed price, with a clear deliverable at the end and a clear methodology for how the findings would be structured. 2 of the 3 hired me for follow-on work. The 3rd gave me a referral. I kept the notebook system from the beginning, tracking every client relationship and every deliverable and every outcome metric, because I had understood from Vantage that what is not measured is not managed and what is not documented is not provable. I was building a case study from the first day and I knew it. By the end of the first year I had billed enough to pay my apartment rent and Sandra's hours and put a small amount back into savings. By the end of the second year I had hired my first full-time employee, an operations analyst named James who had just left a mid-sized consulting firm and who understood exactly what Meridian was doing and why it was doing it differently. I did not tell my family much about any of this. My father asked and I told him. My mother asked and I gave her the summary version. Dana did not ask. The specific model I was developing was built on a gap I had identified during my time at Vantage, which was the gap between what operational consulting firms delivered and what operations teams actually needed. The firms delivered strategy documents and implementation roadmaps and presentations to boards, and operations teams needed someone embedded in the work, sitting in the rooms where the problems actually lived, measuring what was changing in real time and adjusting the approach based on what the measurement showed. Nobody was doing this at the price point accessible to mid-sized companies. The large consultancies did something adjacent to it for enterprise clients at fees that mid-sized companies could not approach. The small boutique consultancies offered strategic advice without the operational depth. Meridian was going to sit between those two and do neither strategy without implementation nor implementation without measurement, but the integrated version that was more demanding to deliver and significantly more valuable to the client. I had developed this framework in the notebooks over the 8 months between the Vantage collapse and the formal registration of the business, and I had tested it against every operational problem I had encountered in 5 years of professional work, and it held. The framework was held. The business was the framework made operational, which was, I thought, a satisfying symmetry for a firm called Meridian Advisory that specialized in operations. I filed the LLC paperwork on a Monday in October and called Sandra the following day and told her I had a new client, which was myself, and that she should invoice accordingly. Sandra said she would and asked if I needed anything else, and I said not yet but soon, and went back to work. By the time I was 32, I had moved Meridian out of my apartment and into a proper office in Fort Worth, for rooms on the third floor of a building on West 7th Street with enough space for a team of 4 and a dedicated client meeting room and a whiteboard wall that I had installed specifically because I thought and worked in diagrams rather than in prose, and I needed the wall space. I had 4 employees and 3 retained clients and a revenue run rate that my accountant told me, with the measured enthusiasm of a man who had seen many promising small businesses fail to sustain their early numbers, was genuinely solid. I had been featured by then in a short piece in the Fort Worth Business Press, which was not a major publication but was the kind of publication that people in the regional business community actually read, and which had described Meridian as a firm to watch in the operational consulting space. I sent the piece to my father, who called that evening and said he was proud of me. I sent it to my mother, who mentioned it at the next family gathering. I did not send it to Dana because I had concluded by then that sending things to Dana was not a productive mechanism, and that the evidence was going to need to reach her through channels that did not allow her to receive it as something being presented to her, which would activate the same dismissal that had always operated between us. Dana did not call about the piece. She did not mention it the next time we spoke, which was at Thanksgiving, where the conversation at dinner covered Dana and Greg's renovation, Dana and Greg's children's school activities, and a television show several of the adults were watching. Meridian did not come up. I ate my dinner and I drove home, and I updated the client pipeline report on my laptop, and I went to sleep at 11:30. I attended 7 family events between the Fort Worth Business Press piece running and the Christmas dinner that was 11 years after the Vantage collapse. And at none of those 7 events did Dana ask me a single substantive question about Meridian. She asked how things were going, which was the social formulation that required a social response rather than a substantive one, and I gave social responses which covered the surface of things without going beneath it. I had stopped offering information about the business to family members who had not asked for it sometime around my 32nd birthday, which was when I understood that the offering of unrequested information to people who received it in the particular way Dana received it was a form of vulnerability I was not going to continue extending. The information was available. The door was open. I was running a registered business with a public presence and a published case study history, and a professional profile that was findable by anyone who decided to look. Dana had not looked, or had looked in the cursory way that produces a general impression rather than a specific understanding. Neither fact was something I could control. What I controlled was the quality of the work and the rigor of the documentation and the care with which I built the professional reputation that would travel through channels Dana could not manage or refrain, and I applied that control every day in the office with complete attention. The years between 32 and 39 were the years of the real building, which looked from outside like growth and from inside like the specific daily work of maintaining and expanding something that had found its shape and needed to be held at that shape while also being extended. I hired carefully and slowly, choosing people for the specific combination of operational intelligence and professional judgment that Meridian's model required, because the model only worked if the people doing the work were genuinely better at it than what the client could get elsewhere. I lost one client at 34 due to a leadership change at the client company, and replaced them within 60 days. I had a difficult 6 months at 35 when 2 projects ran over budget, and I had to have the specific, honest conversations with clients that over-budget projects require, conversations I had prepared for by building the contingency clauses into the contracts carefully enough that the conversations were hard but not catastrophic. I won my first industry award nomination at 36, in the small and specialized world of operational consulting, where award nominations circulated through a network of about 400 people who all knew each other's work and whose assessment of what was excellent in the field was the one that mattered to me. I expanded the team to 11 that year and moved to a larger office in the same building. By 39, Meridian had 19 people, 14 active client relationships, a second award nomination, and the specific settled confidence of a firm that knew what it was and had proven it across a decade of client outcomes. My father had visited the office twice by then and asked the kind of careful, interested questions about the business model that told me he understood it. My mother knew we existed and mentioned us occasionally. Dana had not asked a single substantive question about Meridian in 10 years. Not one. The award nomination at 36 was for the Operations Excellence Award, given by a regional professional association, whose membership consisted of the 400 or so people in the operational consulting and advisory space who mattered in the Texas market. I did not win the nomination that year. I won the second one at 38, and I accepted the award at the association's annual dinner in Dallas with a brief, precise speech that thanked my team and described the Meridian model in the terms I had been developing for a decade, and that landed with a specific recognition of an audience that understood exactly what the model was and what it had taken to build it. My parents came to the dinner. My father sat in the third row and listened to the speech with the focused attention he gave to things he wanted to understand completely. My mother sat beside him and cried quietly during the second paragraph, which she later described as being about the firm but which I understood was about the whole arc, about the Vantage collapse and the 11 years and the daughter who had gone to the couch with the notebook and had not stopped. Dana was not at the dinner. She had not been invited, not because I had chosen not to invite her, but because the dinner was a professional event for professional contacts and she was not in that category. She would have been welcome. The door was always open. She had not tried it. Marcus Webb reached out in January through a direct email to my business address, which told me he had found Meridian through professional channels rather than through any personal connection, because people who found us through personal connections usually emailed through whatever mutual contact had made the introduction. His email was precise and specific. He had been referred by 3 separate people in his network. He had done a preliminary review of Meridian's publicly available case studies. He had a specific operational challenge at Crestfield Industries that he believed matched the firm's expertise, and he would like to schedule a discovery call at my earliest convenience. I read the email and ran the preliminary research I always ran before any discovery call, which covered the company's publicly available financials, press coverage, industry position, and leadership team. The leadership team page of Crestfield's website had headshots and brief bios for the executive team. The VP of Operations was listed as Greg Holloway. The photograph confirmed it was my brother-in-law. I sat with that for a moment. Then I scheduled the discovery call. The discovery call with Marcus was excellent. He was intelligent, direct, and had done enough homework on Meridian before the call that we spent the first 10 minutes confirming alignment rather than explaining the basics. He described the operational challenge at Crestfield with the specific clarity of a CEO who had done his diagnostic work and knew what he was looking at. The challenge was exactly the kind Meridian was built to address. I told him we could help. He asked me to send a proposal. I sent it the following day. 3 days after that, he called to say the board had approved the engagement. That was when I asked Priya to run the conflict check. The discovery call with Marcus Webb lasted 47 minutes, which was longer than my standard 30-minute intake call, but shorter than the calls that went long because the client was disorganized or unclear. Marcus was organized and clear. He had done his homework on Meridian before the call in a way that meant we could skip the explanatory section and go directly to the diagnostic section, which was where the real information was. He described the Crestfield supply chain problem with the specific fluency of a CEO who had spent his first 60 days conducting an operational review, and who had arrived at a clear understanding of what he was looking at. The problem was in the interface between procurement and production scheduling, where a legacy ERP system was not communicating accurately with the newer inventory management software, producing a systematic lag in the materials ordering cycle that was generating production delays at a rate the existing team had been managing around rather than solving. Managing around a systematic problem rather than solving it was exactly the kind of operational pattern Meridian had been built to address, the pattern that produced competent people doing good work in a system that was working against them, and the solving of it required the kind of embedded, measurement-based approach that generalist consultants did not offer. I told Marcus we could help. He asked about the timeline. I said 6 to 9 months for a full restructuring with measurement validation. He said the board would need to see a proposal. I sent it the following day. It was 12 pages and it was exactly right, and Marcus Webb called 3 days later and said yes. I want to be precise about why I did not call Dana when I accepted the Crestfield engagement, because the silence was a choice and choices should be explained honestly rather than left to interpretation. I was not obligated to share client engagements. Meridian's client relationships were confidential professional matters, and I did not discuss them outside the firm regardless of who the client was or who the client's VP of operations happened to be married to. That was the professional reasoning, and it was sound and sufficient. The personal reasoning was also present and was also honest. I had spent 10 years building something that Dana had not asked about once, and I was not going to call her to announce a milestone in that building. If the Crestfield engagement produced results, and I believed it would, the results would be documented and attributed and distributed through professional channels, and Dana would encounter them through those channels rather than through a call from me that would allow her to receive the information as something I was presenting to her rather than as something the professional world had decided was worth noting. I was not setting a trap. I was not engineering a scene. I was running a professional engagement with complete professional integrity, and I was allowing the professional outcomes to travel the way professional outcomes travel, through networks and testimonials and case studies and the word of mouth of satisfied clients. And if those outcomes reached Dana, they would reach her with the weight of external validation rather than the weight of a sister asking to be seen. Those two things were not the same weight. I understood the difference. I had been understanding the difference for 10 years. I want to say one more thing about the decision not to tell Dana, which is that the silence was not passive. It was an active choice made from a clear understanding of what telling her would and would not produce. Telling her would have made me the person announcing a milestone, which would have given her the role of responding to an announcement, which was a role that activated the particular dynamic between us where she evaluated what I was presenting against the fixed version of me rather than receiving it as information about the actual version. The fixed version would have heard, Claire has a significant new engagement. The fixed version would have processed this through the same interpretive frame it had always used, which was, "That's nice, I hope it works out, you know how these things can go." The actual version of what was happening was that Marcus Webb, an experienced turnaround CEO who had been referred by 3 independent sources in his professional network, had concluded that Meridian Advisory was the right firm for a substantial operational challenge at a company with revenue in the mid-hundreds of millions. That was a different sentence than the one the fixed version would produce. For that sentence to reach Dana with its actual weight, it needed to arrive through channels that did not allow the fixed version to intercept and reshape it. The professional world was exactly the right channel. The professional world did not know the fixed version of me existed. It knew only the version I had built. I had done the preparation. I had run the engagement with complete professional integrity. I had documented the outcomes with the rigor I applied to everything. I had let the case study travel through professional channels without directing it toward anyone personally. Every choice had been the professional choice, and the professional choices had been sufficient. The rest was what the rest had always been, which was the work and the evidence it produced and the professional world's assessment of that evidence, and I trusted the professional world's assessment in a way I had long since stopped trusting the family world's assessment, because the professional world had no fixed version of me to protect. Greg Holloway on the first day of the site assessment was a competent, slightly defensive operations professional who had clearly not expected the external consultant his new CEO had brought in to be his wife's sister. I watched him work through the recognition in the moment it happened, the quick recalibration behind his eyes as I came through the conference room door with my site assessment team, the brief stillness of a man who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding in real time what the professional response to it is. He managed it well. He said, "Claire, I didn't know you were," and I said, "It's good to see you, Greg. Should we get started?" And we got started. Over the following 6 weeks of site assessment and systems analysis, I developed a professional respect for Greg Holloway that I had not previously had the opportunity to develop, because we had only ever existed in each other's lives as extensions of the family relationship, rather than as independent professionals. He was good at his job. He had a practical, unsentimental understanding of the Crestfield operations and a willingness to identify problems in his own systems that the less self-aware VP would have been defensive about. He also had, I came to understand, a complicated experience of being Dana's husband, which included a specific practice skill at receiving information about family members with diplomatic neutrality and a genuine unperformed warmth that made him, in the end, easier to work alongside than many clients I had worked with in a decade of professional practice. We did not discuss Dana for the first 6 weeks. Then one afternoon at the end of week 6, in a quiet hallway after a long client meeting, Greg told me that Dana knew. He said it with the expression of a man who has delivered difficult news before, and who is delivering this particular version of it as carefully as he can. He said her reaction had not been anger. He said she had looked at him and said, "I didn't know Claire's company was that kind of company." The 6 weeks of the site assessment were some of the most interesting I had spent in a decade of professional work, and the interest came from an unexpected source, which was Greg Holloway himself. I had known Greg for 11 years as Dana's husband, which meant I had known him in the specific way you know a sibling's partner when the sibling relationship is not warm, as a satellite figure, present at family events but never in the center of the relevant conversations, pleasant and diplomatic and impossible to know well in the constrained context of Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving lunches. Working alongside him at Crestfield was a fundamentally different experience. The professional version of Greg Holloway was a different person from the family version, or not a different person but a fuller one, the version that existed when the Dana mediation layer was removed, and what remained was a man with genuine operational intelligence and the specific courage that good operations professionals have, the courage to identify problems in your own systems rather than defend them. He identified problems in his own systems regularly during the assessment. He did it without defensiveness and without the particular performance of false humility that some clients use to manage the vulnerability of being assessed. He was simply honest about what he saw, which was not universal and not small. At the end of week 6 in the hallway, he told me Dana knew. The expression on his face when he told me was the expression of a man who had thought carefully about how to deliver this information, and had concluded that directly and quietly was the right way. I said, "How did she react?" He said she had not been angry. He said she had said, "I didn't know Claire's company was that kind of company." I said, "Thank you for telling me," and I meant both parts of that sentence. I thought about that sentence for a long time after Greg delivered it. I thought about it driving home from Crestfield that evening, and I thought about it sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, and I thought about it the following morning in the shower, which is where I do my clearest thinking because the shower has no screens and no notebook, and the only thing available to do is think. I didn't know Claire's company was that kind of company. The sentence had several layers, and I turned each of them over carefully because I wanted to understand what Dana had actually meant, rather than what the worst interpretation of it was. The most charitable interpretation was that she had genuinely not understood what Meridian did or how significant an engagement with a company the size of Crestfield was, which would mean the sentence reflected ignorance rather than dismissal. This interpretation was plausible because Dana had not asked about Meridian and therefore had not been given the information that would have corrected the ignorance. The less charitable interpretation was that she had held a fixed, diminished understanding of Meridian for 10 years and had simply never updated it, and that the updating was happening now only because the evidence had arrived in a form she could not manage or reframe, which was the form of her own husband's company being restructured by my firm. Both interpretations were probably partially true. What I understood most clearly thinking about the sentence in the shower on a Tuesday morning was that it was the beginning of something shifting, and that the shift was going to continue regardless of what I did, because the Crestfield engagement was going to produce results, and the results were going to be documented, and the documentation was going to travel through professional channels, and the channels led to places where Dana's professional and social world overlapped with mine. I got out of the shower and I went to work. The shower is where I have always done my clearest thinking, and I want to say something about what the clearest version of the thinking about Dana's sentence produced, which was not anger and not satisfaction and not the anticipation of anything dramatic, but a specific, practical understanding of where things now stood. Dana had a piece of information that did not fit her map. The map was going to have to update, or she was going to have to work very hard to prevent the updating, and I had known Dana long enough to know that she was not, fundamentally, a person who worked hard to maintain an inaccurate map once the inaccuracy was visible to her. She was a person who had never looked closely enough at the map to see the inaccuracy, and now the inaccuracy was visible, because the territory had appeared in a form she could not ignore, which was her own husband's company being restructured by a firm her younger sister had built. The map was going to update. I did not know what the update would look like or how long it would take or what the updated map would mean for the relationship between us. I knew it was happening, and I was prepared to see what it produced. I went to work. The engagement had 4 months left, and the implementation phase was entering its most critical period, and that was where my attention belonged. The engagement ran for 7 months. I will not describe all 7 months in operational detail because that is not the story, but I will say that the work was some of the best Meridian had done, which I attribute to several factors. the specific quality of the operational challenge, which was complex enough to be interesting and structured enough to be addressable, Greg's genuine engagement with the restructuring process, which made the implementation phase significantly smoother than it would have been with a defensive VP, Marcus Webb's leadership clarity, which meant that the organizational resistance that often slowed operational restructuring work was managed at the top rather than left for my team to navigate alone, and the particular quality of attention I brought to this specific engagement, which I will be honest about. I brought more to it, not in terms of hours because I brought the same hours to every engagement, but in terms of the specific quality of care I applied to the outcome metrics and the case study documentation and the rigor of the final report. I brought more because I understood what this case study was going to mean when it was finished, and I wanted it to be beyond argument. 22% reduction in supply chain lead times. 31% improvement in production scheduling efficiency. $1.4 million in annualized cost savings in the first full year of the new system. These were the numbers. They were real numbers verified by the client's finance team, presented to the board by Marcus Webb, attributed explicitly to the Meridian Advisory engagement. Marcus wrote the testimonial himself. He sent it to me before it was published and asked if I wanted any changes. I read it 3 times. I said it was accurate. He published it. The rigor of the documentation was a choice I had made deliberately and maintained deliberately, because I had understood from the Vantage experience that the only thing that survived a corporate collapse was the record of what you had done and what it had produced, and that the record only helped you if it was specific enough to be undeniable. I had kept records from the first Meridian engagement, tracking every outcome metric against the baseline established at the beginning of each project, and I had developed over 10 years of documentation practice that was more rigorous than the industry standard because the industry standard was designed to satisfy client reporting requirements and mine was designed to produce case studies that would travel beyond the client relationship into the professional networks where reputation was built. The Crestfield documentation was the product of 10 years of that practice applied to an engagement that I understood, without sentimentality, was going to produce the most significant case study in Meridian's history. 22% and 31% and $1.4 million were numbers that spoke clearly in any professional context, numbers that required no interpretation and could not be reframed as approximately, or in some respects or for certain types of companies. They were the numbers. They were what the work had produced. They were, in the specific language of the professional world that I had been working in for a decade, the answer to every fixed version of me that had ever been distributed to aunts and cousins and family friends and the neighbor who had known me since childhood. The case study went into Meridian's materials in September, 6 weeks before the Whitfield family Christmas dinner. It was not the first case study I had published, and it was not the most operationally complex engagement Meridian had completed, but it was the one with the specific combination of documented outcomes and named client that made it the most quotable and the most shareable in the professional networks where we operated. Marcus Webb shared it with his network. Meridian shared it through our own professional channels. 3 of our existing clients shared it with their contacts. The case study is named Crestfield Industries. It was named the engagement lead. My name was on it. Dana's husband's company was in it. The professional world in Fort Worth and Dallas was not large, and the social and professional circles Dana moved in overlapped with the professional world in Fort Worth and Dallas in the specific way that happens in mid-size American cities where the business community, the civic community, and the social community all intersect at a relatively small number of events and organizations and networks. I knew the case study would reach her. I did not know exactly how or when. I found out through a text from Greg in mid-October that said simply, "Dee found out about the case study. 2 separate people mentioned it. She's okay." I read the text at my desk and I put my phone face down and I went back to the pipeline report I had been reviewing. I was okay too. The circulation of the case study through professional networks is a thing that happens with a particular inexorable quality that I had watched operate on other firms' materials over 10 years, and that I now watched operate on my own with the specific detached attention of someone who has set something in motion and is observing its trajectory. Professional networks in mid-size American cities operate on overlapping circles of relationship, and the overlapping means that information does not stay in its originating circle, but moves outward through the connections at the edge, arriving eventually in circles that share members with the original circle, but that have different centers. Dana's professional and social world shared members with the professional world in Fort Worth and Dallas. I had always known this. I had always known, with the patient certainty of someone who has understood how information travels through social systems for a very long time, that whatever Meridian produced would eventually reach her through channels she could not manage, and that when it reached her that way it would have the weight of external validation rather than the weight of something I was presenting to her, and that the two weights were fundamentally different in what they produced in a person who received them. The two people who mentioned the case study to Dana in mid-October had done so with the casual warmth of people who assume she already knew. That assumption, the assumption that of course you know, that your sister's professional achievement is of course something you are already current on, was itself a form of information. Dana had received all of it. I had not engineered any of it. I had simply done the work. The professional world in Fort Worth and Dallas was not large and it was not forgiving of inaccuracy, and it had arrived, through its own channels and its own networks and the referrals of 3 independent people who knew Marcus Webb's work, at the same conclusion I had reached about what Meridian was and what Meridian could do. I had not been able to make that argument 11 years ago in a phone call with Dana the night after the Vantage collapse. The professional world had now made it without being asked, in a case study and a journal feature and the referrals of satisfied clients, and the argument could not be dismissed as a sister presenting herself, which was a presentation that could always be received through the fixed versions filter. It was the professional world which had no filter. It was just the evidence. The Christmas dinner at my parents' house in Denton was the same dinner it had always been, held in the same dining room with the same extended leaf table that my father had bought at an estate sale in 1987, and that had hosted every major Whitfield family meal since before I could remember. Carol made the same dishes she always made. The green bean casserole, the glazed ham, the sweet potato bake with the marshmallow top that Dana and I had both loved as children, and had both maintained a complicated adult relationship with. Patricia and her husband Don were there, which was not unusual for Christmas. Don worked in commercial real estate in Dallas and had a broad professional network and was the kind of man who connected things and people as a social habit rather than a strategic one. It was Don who brought up the Crestfield case study, not as a revelation but as a fact he assumed was generally known at this table, because the case study had been mentioned to him by a contact in his network, and he had made the connection to Claire and had assumed that a professional achievement of this kind would have been a topic of family conversation. He said something like, "I was hearing about your firm this week, Claire. The Crestfield work." My contact Bill McNamara mentioned it. Claire's father Frank set down his fork and said, "Tell me about that." And Claire told him. She told the table. Not with performance and not with the energy of someone who has been waiting to say this, but with the even, clear tone she used for professional matters, the same tone she used in client presentations, covering the scope of the engagement and the outcome metrics and the published results. The table listened. Don asked a follow-up question. Frank asked too. Carol said, "How long has Meridian been doing this kind of work?" Claire said, 10 years. And Carol said, 10 years? And there was a pause that lasted several seconds and contained a decade. Don's introduction of the Crestfield case study was exactly the form of arrival I had understood would happen eventually. The casual mention by someone who assumed it was established knowledge, in a room full of people for whom the assumption should have been correct and for one of whom it was not. I watched Dana's face when Don said it. I was not watching for the watching's sake, not with any anticipatory energy, but because I was at the same table and Dana was across from me, and I had learned over 39 years to read her face with a precision that was not available to most people who knew her. What I saw when Don said it was not guilt and not embarrassment and not the pleasantness she used when a social situation required managing. What I saw was the specific expression of someone for whom a piece of information has just landed with a weight they were not prepared for, the recalibration expression, the involuntary internal adjustment of a person whose map has just been shown to be wrong in a public setting. She recovered quickly. She was skilled at recovery. But I had seen it and I understood what it meant, and I held that understanding without doing anything with it. The way you hold something that has not yet found its right moment and that you know will find it when the time is right. I watched my mother's face during that pause and I saw the specific expression of a woman recalibrating, not dramatically, not with guilt, but with the gradual visible quality of someone updating an understanding that has been running on old information without knowing it was old. She had known Meridian existed. She had mentioned it at family events in the way she mentioned many things, in passing, as background to the more immediate news of Dana's children and Greg's promotion and the renovation that had taken 8 months and gone significantly over budget. She had not known what Meridian was in the specific sense of what it had produced and what it was worth in the professional world where it operated, and hearing it described at the dinner table in precise, outcome-based terms was doing something visible to her understanding. Frank was asking another question about the supply chain methodology and I was answering it, and Dana was quiet. Not absent, not visibly distressed, but quiet in the way of someone who is processing more than they are showing, which was unusual for Dana, who was not typically a person who processed privately in social settings. Greg contributed to the conversation 3 times, each contribution grounded in the specific, experience-based knowledge of someone who had worked alongside the Meridian team for 7 months. His contributions were accurate and detailed, and they gave the Meridian description a texture that my own account did not have, the texture of someone who had watched the work happen rather than being the person doing it. Don's wife asked what kind of companies Meridian typically worked with. Dana's older child asked what a consultant actually did. Claire's younger niece, who was 9, said she thought the flame logo on the Meridian website was cool, which meant she had looked up the website, which meant Dana had looked up the website at some point and shown her daughters, and that was the detail that stayed with me longest after the dinner was over. The 9-year-old looking up the Meridian website stayed with me longer than anything else from dinner. I thought about it on the drive home, doing the specific math of how it had happened. Dana had encountered the case study through 2 separate people who had assumed she already knew, and Dana, processing this encounter, had at some point gone to the Meridian website, and at some point the 9-year-old had been nearby when Dana was looking at the site, and the 9-year-old had found the flame logo interesting enough to mention at the Christmas dinner table. The chain of events was small and completely ordinary, and it told me something important about what had happened in the weeks between October and December, which was that Dana had been doing the homework she had not done for 10 years. She had looked at the website. She had read enough of it to have something to show her daughter. She had not called me during that time. She had not reached out in any of the ways that the new information might have prompted, but she had looked, and the looking had produced something, some internal movement that had not yet found its external form, and I was going to see what the form turned out to be without trying to determine it in advance. The drive home took 40 minutes. I used them to think about the pipeline report I needed to finish in the morning, and the client call scheduled for 9, and the team meeting at 11. The dinner was done. The work was next. The sentence that landed was said between the soup course and the main course, when the conversation about Meridian had been running for perhaps 15 minutes. Dana said, "I just didn't know it had gotten so big." She said it with the tone of someone who means it as a compliment and who does not hear, in the saying of it, the implication that she had been tracking a smaller version and had simply lost track of the growth. I looked up from my plate. I said, without performance and without meanness, in the even tone I use for accurate statements, "It's been this size for a while." The table heard it. I know because the specific quality of quiet that followed it was the quality of a table full of people who have heard something that landed further than the speaker intended, and who are choosing collectively not to draw attention to the landing. Carol refilled the water glasses. Don asked a question about the follow-on engagement Marcus Webb had approved. Frank answered a question Greg asked about the supply chain restructuring timeline. The dinner continued. Dana did not say anything for several minutes, and when she spoke again it was to her older daughter about something unrelated to Meridian, and the Meridian conversation was, in the way of family dinner conversations, absorbed into the broader flow of the evening without formal conclusion. But the sentence was there. It had been said. It was in the room and in the table and in the 10 years it had quietly described, and everyone at the dinner who was paying attention, which was everyone, knew it. The sentence is the thing I want to examine most carefully because it was the one that produced the visible landing, and visible landings in family settings are unusual enough that they deserve precision. I just didn't know it had gotten so big. The reason it landed the way it did was structural rather than semantic, which is to say that the sentence was not offensive in its literal content but was devastating in what it revealed about the frame from which it had been spoken. It revealed that Dana had been tracking Meridian in some background way, as something that existed at a certain scale, and that the scale she had been tracking was smaller than the actual scale by a margin that was impossible to maintain once the actual scale had been described at the dinner table in precise, outcome-based terms in front of a group of family members who were all now recalibrating simultaneously. The simultaneous recalibration was the thing. It was not one person discovering the gap between the map and the territory. It was everyone discovering it at the same time in the same room over the glazed ham. The response I gave, "It's been this size for a while," was not calculated. It was simply accurate, and in the context of what had just been revealed by Dana's sentence, the accuracy was its own weight. The table absorbed it in the specific collective way of people who have witnessed something real and have decided, with the social intelligence of a family that had been navigating its own dynamics for 39 years, not to draw further attention to what had just landed. The thing I held on to most carefully in the weeks after Christmas was the sentence I had said, not the sentence Dana had said. It's been this size for a while. I held it not with pride but with the specific quality of recognition that comes from having said something true, and heard it received by a room of people who understood exactly how true it was. The sentence was there now. It was part of the family record. It was not going anywhere. She found me in the kitchen after dinner. I had volunteered to do the dishes because I always volunteered to do the dishes at family dinners, a habit from childhood that I had maintained partly from genuine willingness and partly because the kitchen was the room in my parents' house where I had always found it easiest to think. I was standing at the sink when I heard the kitchen door, and I knew without turning around that it was Dana because of the specific quality of her footstep, which I had known since childhood and which had a particular hesitancy to it that night that was not her usual quality. She stood in the kitchen and she did not say anything for a moment, and I continued washing the dishes because the dishes needed washing, and because silence with Dana had always been something I could wade in more easily than she could. She said, "I feel like I've missed something." I considered that sentence for a moment. I turned off the water. I turned around. I said, "You haven't missed it. It's been there." She said, "I was talking about your company." I said, "I know." There was a pause. She looked at the kitchen counter, not at me. She said, "I told people you had failed. Back then. After Vantage." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I thought I was." She stopped. I said very quietly, not unkindly, "I know what you thought." There was a longer pause. She looked at me then. She said, "I'm sorry." I held those two words for a moment the way I held things I wanted to be accurate about, carefully and without rushing to a response. In 39 years Dana had said those two words to me without qualification or redirection 4 times. I knew the count because I had always counted them. She said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "I know." Not "it's okay," because it was not entirely okay and we were both too old and too honest to pretend it was. Just "I know." I want to say something about how I'm sorry and what I did with it, because what I did with it was not what I might have predicted I would do if I had imagined the moment in advance. I had imagined the moment over the years in various forms. In some of the imagined versions I was colder than I was in the kitchen. In some I was warmer. In some I said things about the 11 years and what they had cost and what it had meant to build without acknowledgement from the person who should have been watching from the beginning. In none of the imagined versions did I simply say "I know" and then ask about coffee. The reason I did what I did rather than any of the imagined versions is that I understood, in the moment of Dana saying "I'm sorry," that the apology was real and complete, and that adding anything to it would be reducing it, would be making it a transaction that required more from her rather than a statement that I was receiving as what it was. I know it was the only response that received it fully without asking for more, and the coffee was the only offer that moved us forward without making the apology the last thing we said to each other in that kitchen. I was 39 years old and I had been carrying the 11 years for the whole of them, and I understood in that kitchen that I was ready to put some of the weight down. Not all of it. Some of it. The some that could be put down without being dishonest about what remained. I want to be precise about that kitchen conversation because it is easy to describe it as a resolution, and it was not exactly a resolution. It was the beginning of something different. And the beginning of something different is not the same as the resolution of something old. What happened in the kitchen was that 2 women who had been running a certain version of their relationship for a very long time acknowledged, in the specific, careful way of people who do not have the vocabulary for large emotional reckoning, that the version had been inaccurate. Dana had held an inaccurate map of me and had used that map to navigate decisions about my life that she had communicated to the extended family. And the map had been wrong, and she knew it and I knew it, and we were both standing in our parents' kitchen with that knowledge between us. The "I'm sorry" was real. I know it was real because Dana was not a person who said things to manage a situation unless she needed to. And she did not need to in that kitchen. She could have deflected or reframed or found her way to a version of the conversation where the direct acknowledgement was not required. She chose the direct acknowledgement. I received it as what it was, which was real, and I said "I know," which was my way of saying "I hear you and I believe you, and I am not going to ask for more than this right now because more than this is not available tonight, and what is available tonight is enough to begin with." I asked her if she wanted more coffee. She said yes. I made the coffee. We stood in the kitchen and we talked, not about Meridian and not about Vantage, but about Dana's older daughter who was struggling with a difficult teacher, and about a book I had been reading, and about a road trip Carol and Frank were planning for the spring. We talked for 40 minutes, and the talking had a different quality from the talking we had done at any family dinner in the last 10 years, looser and more honest and less shaped by the weight of what was not being said. That difference was the thing I noticed most as I drove home. What I want to say about the 40-minute kitchen conversation is that it was not the resolution of the story but the beginning of a different chapter of it, which is a distinction that matters because resolutions are neat and beginnings are not. Dana and I talked about her daughter's difficult teacher, and I made suggestions from my own memory of being a child in a school, and Dana listened and added things, and we were, for 40 minutes, simply sisters talking about a child's problem in their parents' kitchen on Christmas night. And this was both more and less significant than any confrontation about the 11 years would have been. More because it was real and present and based on actual exchange rather than performed emotion. Less because it left the 11 years largely in the place where the 11 years had been, not resolved but acknowledged. And the acknowledgement was the beginning of the work of carrying them differently rather than the end of the carrying. I drove home on empty Christmas highways thinking about the word beginning and what it asked of both of us, which was patience, and whether I had enough of it after 39 years of already being patient in various forms. I concluded I did. I had built a firm from a notebook and a couch in Fort Worth and 19 years of daily forward motion. Patience was not a resource I was short of. I had, if anything, built a surplus. January came and went and February came, and on the 14th of February, which was a Monday and therefore a workday in which I gave no particular attention to the romantic holiday associations of the date, Dana called me at noon from what sounded like her car. She did not call at noon very often. She called in the evenings, the standard evening check-in call between sisters that we had maintained even through the difficult years, the call that covered the surface of things and occasionally went deeper, and which had been the thread of connection between us when the connection had been thinner than it should have been. A noon call was different, and I registered the difference when I answered. She asked how I was and I said fine, and she said she had a question if I had a few minutes. I said I had a few minutes. She said she had been thinking about Meridian. She said she wanted to understand better what kind of companies the firm worked with, what the typical engagement looked like, and what the point of entry was for a company that needed that kind of help. I answered all of it. I answered it the way I answered questions about Meridian to anyone who asked, with genuine curiosity rather than social obligation, which was completely and with the specific pleasure I had always taken in explaining the work to people who were actually listening. The call lasted 40 minutes. She asked 4 follow-up questions, each one building on the previous answer in a way that told me she was tracking the logic rather than simply collecting facts. At the end of the call she said, "I feel like I've been walking past a building for 10 years without looking at what was inside it." I said, "The door was always open." She said, "I know." And the knowing in her voice was the same knowing I had heard in the kitchen at Christmas, the specific, uncomfortable knowing of someone who has found the gap between what they understood and what was true and is doing the work of sitting with it. The specific quality of the February call was different from any call Dana and I had had in a decade, and the difference was in the listening. She listened the way she had listened in the kitchen at Christmas, fully and without the particular half attention that indicated she was formulating her response rather than receiving what I was saying. The questions were the tell. People who are formulating their response ask the next question on their internal list regardless of what you have just said. People who are actually listening ask questions that come from what you have just said, that build on it or push on one of its edges or ask for the specific part of it that is not yet clear. Dana's questions in the February call built on what I had said. The second one built on the first. The third pushed on an edge of the second in a way that told me she had understood the distinction I had been drawing and wanted to examine it more closely. This was not the Dana I had been talking to at family dinners for 11 years. This was a version of Dana with updated information and the willingness to use it, and the willingness was the part that mattered most because the information had always been available and the willingness was what had been absent. I told her everything she asked, and I told it carefully, and without any of the protective shortening I had applied to conversations about Meridian for a decade. I gave her the real version. March was when the referral came. Dana was at a professional networking event in Dallas, the kind of quarterly industry mixer that she attended as part of maintaining the professional relationships her marketing career required. and she found herself in a conversation with a woman named Suzanne who ran operations for a regional distribution company and who mentioned, in the context of a broader conversation about operational challenges, that her company had been struggling with a systems integration problem that their internal team had not been able to solve. Dana said, "I might know a firm that could help with that." She said it, according to Dana's own account of the conversation, with the specific confidence of someone who had done the homework, who knew what the firm did and how it did it and what kinds of problems it was built to address. She got Suzanne's contact information. She texted it to me the following day with a message that said, "Met someone at an event last night who might be a fit for Meridian. I thought it might be useful." I read the text at my desk on a Thursday afternoon. I read it twice. I thought about the Tuesday 11 years ago when I had sat on my couch in Fort Worth after the Vantage collapse and listened to Dana tell me she had always worried that maybe this was a sign that she had been telling Greg she wasn't sure the startup world was right for me. I thought about the notebook I had opened that night and the date I had written at the top of the first page. Then I called Derek, my business development manager, and told him I had a referral to pass his way. And I gave him Suzanne's name and contact information, and I said, "Treat it like any other qualified lead." Because it was. That was what it was now. I want to say something about the text Dana sent with Suzanne's contact information, which was, "Thought this might be useful." 5 words. No preamble, no context setting, no explicit acknowledgement that this was a significant gesture in the context of what our relationship had been. Just the information offered in the direct, practical register that I had always used for professional exchange and that Dana was using now, and the using of it was the gesture. It said, "I understand what you need." Said, "I know how this works." It said, "I have been paying attention and the attention has produced something I can offer you." None of this was stated. All of it was in the 5 words and the contact name beneath them. I had been in professional services for 15 years and I had received many referrals from many sources and I had understood each of them as what they were, which was a person or organization putting their own professional credibility behind a recommendation, staking something on the accuracy of their assessment of the fit. Dana had staked something on this one. She had gone to a professional event as a marketing professional and she had identified a problem in a conversation and she had connected it to a firm she now understood well enough to know the problem fit the practice and she had offered the connection. That was not nothing. That was, in the specific economy of professional services, a meaningful act. I forwarded the contact to Derek and I said treat it like any other qualified lead because it was, and because that was the right frame for what it was, which was a referral from someone who had finally done the homework. Suzanne became a Meridian client 4 months later. After a discovery call and a proposal and a contract negotiation that Derek managed with the same professional care, he brought to every engagement. The contract was for a 6-month systems integration assessment with an option to extend, which was the standard Meridian structure for an engagement of that type. Derek mentioned in passing that the referral had come from a personal contact of mine and I said, "Yes, my sister," and Derek said, "Good referral, she understood what we do." I said, "She's been learning." The Suzanne engagement was not the largest Meridian had taken on, and it was not the most complex and it did not produce a case study of the magnitude of Crestfield. It was a solid engagement that produced good results and a satisfied client and a professional relationship that Meridian would maintain and that would likely produce further referrals over time, which was how most professional services businesses grew, through the accumulated trust of people who had experienced the work and were willing to say so to others. What the Suzanne engagement meant to me was not in its operational parameters. It was in the fact that Dana had been at a professional event and had listened to someone describe a problem and had thought of Meridian and had known enough about what Meridian did to understand that the problem fit the practice and had said so with confidence and had gotten the contact information and had texted it to me the following day. That sequence required knowledge she had not had a year ago. It required a change in how she understood me and my work. The change had happened. I was not going to over-describe it or attach more weight to it than it could carry. But it had happened and it was real and I received it as what it was. The Suzanne engagement was the first business that came to Meridian through Dana, and it was not the last. Over the following 18 months, Dana referred 2 more contacts, both of which became clients after the standard intake process. She did not accompany the referrals with any explanation or commentary. She sent the name and the contact information and the 1-line description of the problem she had understood from the conversation, and she was right about the fit each time, which meant the homework had continued past the February call and past the Suzanne referral and had become something more like a sustained attention, the kind of attention that produces accurate assessments over time because it is maintained rather than occasional. I did not tell Dana she was getting better at it. Derek noticed it independently at some point in the second half of the year, and mentioned to me in passing that the referrals coming through my personal network had a notably high conversion rate. I said, I have a good network. He said it seemed like someone in the network had a specific understanding of what Meridian did. I said, she's been learning. He did not ask who she was. The professional information was sufficient. The personal context was mine, and I carried it the way I carried most things, accurately and without excess, in the specific manner of someone who has been carrying things for a long time and has gotten efficient at it. The thing I want to say about the relationship between me and Dana in the months after Christmas is that it did not become simple. It did not become warm in the easy, frictionless way that relationships become warm in stories about reconciliation. It became more honest, which is both better and harder than simple, because honesty requires maintenance in a way that surface warmth does not, and the maintenance is work, and the work is not always comfortable. Dana said things in some of our calls that showed me the old map was still present underneath the new updating, moments where her framing of something I was doing or considering had the old fixed version quality to it, and I responded to those moments by saying something accurate and moving on, not making a confrontation of it but not letting it pass unmarked. She heard the corrections and incorporated them, which was more than I had expected, and which I said nothing about because pointing to evidence of growth tends to be less useful than simply allowing the growth to continue at its own pace. She came to the Meridian office in April, which was the first time she had been inside the office in 10 years. She walked through it with the careful, slightly overwhelmed expression of someone recalibrating a spatial understanding, taking in the size of the team and the current client board and the evidence of the specific, developed professional life that had been running parallel to her fixed map of me. She did not say much during the visit. When she left, she stood in the lobby and she said, "You built all of this?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad you did." I said, "Me too." We hugged in the Meridian lobby and she went to her car and I went back to my office and I sat at my desk for a few minutes before I picked up the next item on my agenda, because some moments deserve a few minutes before you move past them. The visit to the Meridian office in April was Dana's first time inside the office since I had moved to West 7th, which was 4 years into the building's occupation and therefore a measure of how long the door had been open and unlocked. She came on a Wednesday afternoon during a window I had cleared in my calendar, and I walked her through the floor in the way I walked any visitor through it, pointing out the current client board and the team structure and the case study wall where I kept the published documentation of completed engagements. The case study wall was the thing she stood in front of the longest. It was floor to ceiling on one side of the main workspace, 37 published case studies organized chronologically, beginning with the small engagement from year one that I had documented with the same rigor I brought to everything because rigor was the habit and habits don't have exceptions. She read several of them. Not the summaries but the specifics, the outcome metrics and the engagement timelines and the client testimonials. She was quiet while she read. When she had finished, she stood back from the wall and looked at the whole of it and she said, "This is what 10 years looks like." I said yes. She said it with a quality I had not heard from her before, something that was not quite admiration and not quite guilt but was the specific compound of those two things that comes from understanding simultaneously that something is genuinely impressive and that you have not been paying the attention it deserved. My father came to the office in May for the second time since Meridian moved into the West 7th building. He came on a Tuesday morning and I cleared an hour in my calendar, and I walked him through the current client map and the team structure and the pipeline for the next 2 quarters. He asked the specific, careful questions he had always asked about the business, the kind that told me he had been thinking about it between visits rather than arriving fresh each time. He said at the end of the hour, "Your operations model is more sophisticated than I realized." I said, "It's been developing for 10 years." He said he knew that and that he meant it differently, that he had understood it was developing but had not understood the specific sophistication it had reached, and that understanding the sophistication now was making him recalibrate some of his earlier assessments of what the challenges of the first few years had actually been and what they had required to navigate. He was a precise man, and this was his precise way of saying that he had not fully understood what I had built and that he understood it better now. I received it as it was. He asked me to lunch and we went to a Thai place 2 blocks from the office that I had been eating at for 4 years and that knew my order, and over lunch he told me about a structural engineering colleague who was having operational problems at his firm and asked if that kind of problem was in Meridian's range. I said, "Tell me more about it." He told me. I listened. I pulled a card from my wallet and slid it across the table and said to have his colleague call Derek, and that we would run the standard intake process and see if it was a fit. My father picked up the card. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "Meridian Advisory. Operations Consulting. That is exactly what you do." I said, "Yes. That is exactly what I do." My father's lunch visit in May was the third time he had been to the Meridian office, and it had the quality of the third time, familiar and relaxed and free of the particular formality that had marked the first two. He ate his lunch with the ease of someone in a place he has come to know, and he asked his questions with the ease of someone whose previous questions have been answered well enough to build on. When he said your operations model is more sophisticated than I realized, he said it with the tone of a man who is not apologizing for the underestimation but is making an accurate note of it, and I received it in the same spirit. He was a precise man, and his precision had always been something I had inherited and valued and built on, and the precision with which he acknowledged the gap between his earlier understanding and his current one was, in its way, a form of respect. The introduction of his engineering colleague as a potential client was the form of contribution available to him, and he offered it with the same directness he brought to everything, simply and without ceremony. The contact slid across the table on a card because he understood that the next step was a professional step, and professional steps had the right form. The right form was the card and the instruction to call Derek, and the statement that was both information and something more: Meridian Advisory. Operations Consulting. That is exactly what you do. He had never said it that clearly before. He had understood it, I think, for some time. The saying of it clearly was new. The case study that Marcus Webb published was picked up in October by a regional business journal that ran a short feature on successful turnaround engagements in the North Texas business community. The feature used Crestfield as its primary example and quoted Marcus Webb extensively, and included a paragraph about Meridian Advisory and a quote from me about the operational restructuring methodology. The feature was read by several hundred people in the regional business community and generated 3 inbound inquiries to Derek in the week it was published, which was a better conversion rate from a single piece of press coverage than anything Meridian had produced before. One of the 3 inquiries became a client. The feature was shared by several of the people who had seen it, including, I learned later from my cousin Becca, who had a habit of monitoring the regional business press in the way that detail-oriented people monitor things they find interesting, by a woman named Sheila Kester, who had been at the family dinner 11 years ago when Dana had told people about the Vantage collapse, and who had said, according to Becca, that she had always thought Claire was talented, which was a thing Sheila Kester had not said 11 years ago, and which Becca delivered to me with the dry, affectionate precision that had always made her my favorite cousin. I said, "Good to know." I sent Becca flowers. She called to say they were too much, and I said they were exactly right, and she said she supposed they were, and we talked for an hour about other things entirely. The way you talk when the significant things have already been said, and what's left is the comfortable, ongoing texture of a relationship that has been real for a long time. The Regional Business Journal feature ran on a Thursday morning, and I read it at my desk with the professional attention I gave to all press coverage of Meridian, which was the attention of someone checking accuracy rather than appreciating recognition, because recognition that was inaccurate was worse than no recognition, and I would have called to correct it if it had been wrong. It was not wrong. It was precise and well reported, and it described the Crestfield engagement with the specific operational language that told me the journalist had understood what I had explained and had reproduced it faithfully, which was not universal among business journalists covering professional services, and was something I noted with genuine appreciation. The 3 inbound inquiries it generated in the first week were of a quality that told me the journal's readership matched Meridian's client profile well, which was useful information for future press strategy. The one that became a client was a distribution company in San Antonio that had a production scheduling problem structurally similar to Crestfield's, which meant the Crestfield case study had functioned exactly as case studies were intended to function, as proof of concept for a class of problem, rather than as a description of a single event. Becca's call about Sheila Kester made me laugh in a way I had not expected, the specific, genuine laugh of someone who has received information that is both funny and accurate. And I sent Becca flowers because Becca had been sending me the right information for 11 years, and it was time the account was settled. I was at my desk on a Thursday afternoon in November, reviewing the next quarter's client pipeline, when my phone rang. It was Dana. She was at an event in Dallas, some industry mixer or networking lunch or the kind of professional gathering that populated her calendar in the regular way, and she had been in a conversation with someone she had just met, a woman who ran the operations function for a regional healthcare equipment company, and the conversation had moved toward the specific operational challenges of managing inventory across multiple fulfillment locations, which Dana had recognized, with the knowledge she had been building since February, as the kind of problem that sat squarely in Meridian's practice area. She had gotten the woman's card. She was calling before she left the event because she wanted to make sure she had understood the fit correctly before she said anything to the woman about the firm. She said, "Inventory management across distributed fulfillment, that's in your range, right?" I put down the pipeline report. I picked up a pen. I said, "Tell me about them." She told me. The company had 4 distribution centers in the Southwest, a legacy inventory system that was not talking to the newer fulfillment software, and a series of fulfillment errors over the previous 18 months that had cost them 2 mid-size retail contracts. I listened to all of it. The pen moved. The notes were good. When she finished, I said, "Yes, that's in our range. That's exactly in our range. Get me her contact information." Dana said she would text it over. I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm getting better at knowing what fits." I said, "You are." And that was the end of the call, but not the end of the thing the call was part of, which was a relationship between 2 sisters that had finally, after 39 years and 1 failed startup and 10 years of building and the silence left by a story told about failure, found its way to something that worked. Dana's text arrived 2 minutes later with the contact's name and number. I forwarded it to Derek with the note: "Qualified lead, warm referral, priority follow-up." Then I picked up the pipeline report and went back to work because the pipeline was the next thing on the agenda and the work was always the next thing on the agenda and the work was what Meridian was and the work was what I was, and after 39 years and all of it, I was entirely at peace with both of those facts. I want to say what the call was because it deserves to be said clearly. It was Dana, at a professional event, having a conversation with a stranger about a business problem, and using 10 months of accumulated understanding about what Meridian did and how it worked to identify whether the problem fit the practice, and calling me before she left the room to check her understanding before she committed herself to a referral, because she was a professional and professionals check their understanding before they commit. That was what the call was. It was also, in the specific personal language of 2 sisters who had been running a broken version of their relationship for 11 years and were now running a different version, something more. It was Dana knowing the work. It was Dana bringing the work forward. It was the door that had always been open, finally walked through, in the specific direction that produced something useful for both of us. Picked up the pen. I took the notes. I said, "Tell me about them." And she did. If someone told the story of your failure before you had a chance to write the story of what came next, this one is for you. You do not need their permission to build. You do not need their understanding to begin. You only need the notebook and the date and the willingness to move toward it one day at a time until the evidence is impossible to misread. Drop your city in the comments if this reached you somewhere real today. And if you know someone building something serious in the quiet left by someone else's narrative, send this to them. Work is always the answer. The work is always enough.